Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Business Health Check series, of which we are going to be talking about crisis recovery for small business. I'm really pleased today that we are joined by my fellow director, Tristan Travis, who is a consultant and company director with over 30 years of management experience in both the public and private sector. 20 of those have been in leadership positions. But in addition to this, he actually has worked within an exporting business. He's worked within complex global supply chain businesses, and he has led them through a lot of the crises that we are experiencing today. So we couldn't have a better person that could blend both the experience of working within the business environment, but then on the other side, using that to help to drive policy and services to work to support businesses. So I'm really delighted he's joining us today. I guess just a general health check series. What happens is once I hand over the full controls to Tristan, I tend to turn my video off. So you can concentrate on the presentation. We generally run through the presentation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we open it up for questions at the end. If you are joining us, generally, please send me questions in the chat box. I then will address those to Tristan at the end. Make sure you keep everything muted, just because otherwise we get a lot of background noise. So Tristan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome to everyone who's tuned in to today's session. Look, it's quite topical at the moment, crisis recovery, because the whole world is suffering a pandemic in some form or another, and therefore the crisis is ubiquitous. But normally crises aren't, they're more localised than they are at the moment. So as Lisa pointed out, I've spent the last 30 years either driving medium-sized export-focused businesses or advising small to medium businesses on how to grow their business and to grow their international engagement. What I'd like to focus on today is what constitutes a crisis, and it is broader than necessarily the crisis that we're enduring today through the pandemic, and it's about setting your mind to being prepared for any crisis that occurs within your business. How we manage our way out of a crisis or out of a disaster, planning and managing supply chains in a crisis, because often the crisis is not just within your business, but its impact is felt either in your supply chains or in your channel partners for delivery, and how you manage those is critical to the ongoing business continuity. But equally, you can have disasters in one of your suppliers, and how do you manage that? Of course, within many crises, and you're certainly seeing that today, there are opportunities, and it's important that you seek those opportunities when they arise. And finally, although we're living through a crisis today, generally, how do we plan? How do we leverage what we do today and plan for a future crisis? So if I go to the first topic around what constitutes a crisis, and with the current pandemic being very front of mind, it's important to view the breadth of what a crisis is. The pandemic is just one manifestation of a crisis, but crises are very broad across a business, and we need to be prepared for all. Some are short-term and simple. Some, like the pandemic, are long-term and will have enduring consequences. But it's important that we plan for and seek to mitigate or prevent any crises. And by way of example, a crisis could be a factory fire. I mean, it could be a supply chain disruption, a supplier or disruption, loss of a supplier, and that could be because they had a disaster in their facility, or they had an economic disaster and an economic failure. So suppliers, supply chain disruptions. One that's fairly common at the moment would be cyber attack or IT systems failure. That in itself is a crisis that needs to be dealt with. They're generally short term. Or loss of utilities, power or water or another utility essential to the business. They tend to be localised crises. They just affect the business. They tend to be more operational. They tend to impact the operations of the business. They need to be planned for. They need to be managed. And in many cases, they can be managed through a backup supply system. Then you've got more regional crises, such as earthquakes or adverse weather conditions, fires, and which Australia suffered earlier this year. Sort of, not fire in the factory, but fire through the region. Floods, excessive wind damage, whether that be a hurricane or tornado or a cyclone, depending on the language that you're using at the time. Or it could be that you were snowbound and there's excessive snowfall. Those types of crises tend to be more regional. They tend to be much more transactional. They often impact the transport logistics and the ability to access markets. And they do require some thinking about what are the alternate transport and logistic options. And then, of course, you get the crises like the one we're enduring at the moment, the current COVID-19 pandemic, which are global. The other major global crisis is when you have a global economic collapse, as we had in 2008. They tend to be highly disruptive, and they often change the way economies and trade function. And in many cases, they have a very long-lasting impact or a long-lasting effect. And those changes endure. We don't go back. There is no going back to pre-COVID. I think we'll see life change in this current pandemic, and we won't go back to how it was. We'll have a new normal. But all crises have some form of enduring impact on a business, even if it's just a lesson in how to deal with that crisis next time it comes, and being more prepared. But the impact is really governed by how well a business responds to the crises. Late responders often have a longer lasting negative impact. And it's also driven by the duration of the crisis. A short telco outage that means that you're offline and you have to deal with customer responses to being offline are generally dealt with, and you can deal with those quickly, so the impact is less enduring. But in the case of a pandemic like we're seeing at the moment, the duration can be weeks, months, years. And I suspect that we will see this one being a multiple of months and probably a multiple of years. And those are the crises that tend to be much more disruptive and leave a much greater change to how we do business. In 2017, a Horizon Scan report from the Business Continuity Institute surveyed a number of respondents about the business disruptions of their preceding 12 months. And the largest number of disruptions was actually IT or telecommunications outages, unplanned outages. 72% of businesses had suffered some form of unplanned IT or telecommunication disruption. 43% had suffered adverse weather impacts. Now, that's everything from minor damage through to major damage. But 43% of businesses had suffered adverse weather events. 40% had had a utility supply disruption. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean to say if you've got backup generators and UPS systems that that's an enduring crisis. It's one that if you were well planned for, you'll suffer less, but if you haven't planned for, you will endure and suffer a greater impact. 35% of businesses had suffered a cyber attack. Someone had maliciously sought to gain access to their digital systems. So that's a fairly good indicator of the prevalence of crises for business. So when you are hit with a crisis, and you'll never know it's coming until it comes, how do you manage your way out of it? And the key here is the better prepared you are, the easier it is to manage your way out. If you've got a well-planned approach, then you will reduce the impact of the crises, and you'll benefit the long-term health of any business, small, medium or large, it doesn't matter. Most large enterprises have quite comprehensive business disruption or business continuity planning, and they suffer less impact because of that. And like so many aspects of managing any business, managing a crisis is essentially risk management. As with any risk management, planning to eliminate, reduce or mitigate those risks is the key to prosperity. Every business should have a business continuity and disaster recovery plan so that they're prepared. So when is the right time to undertake disaster planning? It's like the old saying, when's the best time to plant a forest? 20 years ago, but if you didn't do it then, now. Even if you're in the crisis, now, if you don't have a business continuity plan, now is the best time to plan. If you're not in a crisis, now is still the best time to plan. But what happens if you find yourself in a crisis and you don't have a plan? Well, if you don't have a plan, your response is actually not too dissimilar to if you do have a plan. The only difference is that the response will have to be delivered without any preparation, any time to consider alternatives. It'll be made on the fly, and it's probably going to be weaker and less sustainable than if you do have a plan. If you have a plan, then you've considered alternatives and you've arranged or you've prepared to access those alternatives. But planning for or responding immediately to a crisis, the steps are the same. The first step in any response is to confirm employee and workplace safety. Now, in a flood or a fire, or it is about making sure everybody and everything is safe. In a power disruption, it is about ensuring that people are safe, because often safety systems run on power, and if there's no power, the safety system has failed. And in some work I've done recently around industrial chemical processing facilities, the key risk is a failure of the safety system, and therefore uninterrupted power supplies and backup power supplies are absolutely critical to ensuring that that risk maintains the safety of people. So the first and most critical response in any crisis is to confirm the safety of your staff, the safety of your people, and the safety of your facility. Once you've done that, assess the situation, identify the risks and the challenges and the opportunities. And even if you have a plan, these will be the first response in your plan to ensure there are no anomalies or opportunities presented that were not foreseen in the planning. So assessing the situation, absolutely first critical step, even if you have a plan. It's important when you do that to ensure that you record your assessments and your responses to improve your disaster planning in the future. Now, if you don't have a plan, it's important to record those assessments and responses so that when you get on the other side of the crisis, you actually can draft a plan and draft a meaningful plan that has the experience, the lived experience of dealing with the opportunities and the challenges that are presented. Now, obviously, every time you have a different crisis, those will be different opportunities and different challenges, and every type of crisis presents different opportunities and different challenges. But it's important that you record your assessments and your responses, because it actually adds to your thinking when you come to address future crises. There are often significant commonality in responses to different multiple crises. Confirming safety of people, confirming the safety of buildings, machinery and goods, identifying risks and further vulnerabilities, determining what is mission critical processes, services and resources, and assessing them against the severity of impact, and consider the appropriate responses. The next step in managing a crisis is actually allocating appropriate resources. Often in a crisis, resources are scarce and they become more valuable. If you're losing revenue, then cash flow is critical. Equally, crises create their own costs. There's additional costs that need to be borne in a crisis. So maintaining that cash flow, that limited cash flow, and putting it across. You've jumped way ahead there on the slides, Lisa. So allocating resources is critical, and whether that be financial resources, whether that be people, whether that be facilities, whether that be stock, whether that be other resources, it is critical that you actually sit down in a crisis and determine what is mission critical, what is important, what can be sacrificed, what you do need to do, what you do need, and what you don't need, and what you don't need to do. And then allocate your resources to use them efficiently and effectively, because they are more scarce. Now, in doing that, you need to review budgets and reallocate as necessary. Create a response team to drive the recovery. So actually put resource into managing the response. Don't assume that it will self-manage, or that you as the CEO can do it all on your own. In a crisis, as in any time, but more so in a crisis, the diversity of thoughts and the diversity of ideas and the diversity of thinking adds enormous value to how you manage the crisis and how well you succeed in coming out the other end as a healthy business. You need to consider reallocating staff or even roles. What are essential roles? Who can be redeployed? What new roles need to be created? You need to allocate and protect mission critical equipment, technology and processes. So what bits do I need to keep? What bits don't I need to keep? You need to obtain outside assistance and expertise. And one of the fundamental dilemmas in a small business is the breadth of specialist knowledge and skills. So it's important in preparing and responding to a crisis that you engage the best specialist capabilities available. For many SMEs, this means using professional contractors or advisory services. Often in large businesses, they have employed whole teams of people with professional expertise in preparation for a crisis. But in an SME, that's not normality. So when you do get to a crisis, know who you're going to engage as a professional or expertise, and seek that professional and expert advice. The next part of managing your way out of a crisis is working with stakeholders. And that's a very broad view of stakeholders. It's your suppliers, it's your customers, it's governments, it's regulators, it's financiers, they're all stakeholders in your business, and in some cases, even competitors will understand your situation and will be willing to assist where they can. It's important that you communicate with stakeholders in an open and timely fashion. And in communicating with stakeholders, you need to seek acceptance for your situation, even if it's a shared situation like a global crisis. You need to engage with your stakeholders to seek alternative options and to seek assistance from stakeholders. And that assistance can take many forms. And, you know, it's an enormous hypothetical list, and without detracting from the extent of that list, it may include things like alternative sources of supply or alternative distribution channels or distribution points, the temporary relaxation of regulations or charges. And governments are doing that at the moment, and they do that around a number of crises. Debt relief or payment deferrals. If you don't ask, you don't get. Talk to your financiers in a crisis. They understand the situation that you're in. They've seen it before with other customers or other debtors. And many of your suppliers and your financiers will be willing to help get you through the crises, because they know that for their business, your long-term survival is good for them. Support in the form of additional supply capacity. If a manufacturing facility is shut down temporarily, how do you maintain supply? Opportunities for new or modified products or service offerings. I mean, the current pandemic has created lots of opportunities for manufacturers to transition what they do. And many businesses in this current environment have transitioned their business or repositioned their market to online delivery rather than face-to-face delivery. So they're all opportunities that you can seek in partnership and consultation with your stakeholders. The other piece of managing your way out of a crisis is planning for recovery. Being prepared and preventing or mitigating a crisis is ultimately the best response. If you can prevent it happening, or if you can mitigate its impact, it's great. However, in any crisis, a plan is essential to speedy recovery. So, as I said earlier on, if you don't have a plan and you're in a crisis, now is the best time to form a disaster recovery team and develop a plan. And in that, you need to identify what are the core actions and the new roles and teams required. Assign those responsibilities. You don't have time to develop lengthy operating procedures, but you do have time to put together checklists and flowcharts or decision trees that are very quick, often hand-drawn, means to detailing the tasks that encourage recovery. And finally, you need to monitor the actions and the outcomes and be prepared to change your plan, because the crises most crises are completely independent variables that govern themselves and aren't governed by you. During the current COVID pandemic, it's a good time to record the risks and responses that you are facing. Equally, if you're facing a downturn and you have a bit of spare time, it is a really good time to start drafting a business continuity or disaster response plan. And I think finally on managing your way out of a crisis, the key is timely communications. The ability to act quickly in a business disruption is important, but having timely communications and being prepared for those communications with stakeholders is important. So in a plan, and if you haven't got a plan, at the very start of the crisis, it's important to actually list out who are your stakeholders, their contacts, and those stakeholders often include, well, they will include employees, they'll include first responders, so that you can very quickly get emergency support. customers, suppliers, subcontractors, regulators, shareholders. Segment your stakeholders into relevant categories and identify the key messaging platforms so that you don't have to talk to them individually, that you can actually talk to them collectively. So what are the best means to doing that? I mean, customers will have a different platform to employees. Employees, it might be a distribution list on email, but customers, it might be a Facebook page. And develop your messaging templates. Now, if you've done this in a plan, that's great. If you haven't got a plan, then you need to develop them fairly quickly. But how do you want to message, and what are the key messages and the timelines for communication? Critical to have those planned so they can be delivered very quickly as they are needed. But finally, be resilient. Learn from the experience and be prepared for your next crisis, because there's one guarantee about this crisis, and that is it won't be the last. There will be more. There will be others. And so learn the valuable lessons and ensure you document, at least in note form for now, how you deal with issues and how you could deal with them better in a future crisis. And ensure that when you're through the crisis and things have settled down, that you actually take the time to reflect on those notes and review your recovery plans, or draft your recovery plans if you haven't already got them. So the next slide, Lisa, is planning and managing supply chains in a crisis. Slide 5. So as I said earlier, not only can you suffer a crisis, but so can your supply chains. And it's important that you plan for that as well. And those impacts can be the loss of supply because the supplier can't meet the need, or loss of logistics provide services, or transport routes are blocked or destroyed or damaged, or you lose distribution channels. So in your planning or in your early dealing with a crisis, you need to, as you assess if loss of supply chain is a risk, you need to assess what are the alternative sources of supply. And if you can have those pre-identified and have a relationship with them already, that's good. It's also why it's great to actually have multiple supply alternatives, so not necessarily being dependent on one supplier or one logistics path. And if you've got one port of entry, that's great. 2 ports is even better, because they're valuable to ensuring that continuity. They balance off that risk. But core considerations in managing your supply chain to counter disruptions is building in redundant supply chain capacity. So what is the redundancy in your supply chain? So what is the fallback position? What is plan B if your supplier, and having that already in your supply chain. So multiple suppliers, or even a redundancy contract, a contract that says that if I fail to get my supply here, then I can get it there. Having multiple suppliers or backup suppliers, keeping the core elements of supply close to you, both physically and in terms of relationships, having really strong relationships with your core supply elements. Maintain multiple logistics and supply chain or supply route options, and ensure where you can that there's a geographic spread of suppliers. Because a lot of supply chain disruptions are regional. And if the flood goes through the town and your suppliers are on either side of the river and both are flooded, you have no reserve capacity. If you've got them in different regions, then you might lose one, but you'll keep the other. And make sure that you've got backup. So uninterrupted power supplies, backup generators, backup water supplies, are all essential parts of your supply chain, need to be managed. And also make sure that you have on hand your supply chain your supply specifications. so that if you do need to seek alternative suppliers quickly, you know exactly what you want and you can describe that in a written form very quickly, and you can engage a contract for supply very quickly. The other part of the supply chain piece is when you lose production capacity. What does that mean? Often in a crisis, the loss of supply capacity means loss of your primary income. So then it's your ability to transition to alternate supply capacity. Now that could be, if you're a manufacturer, it could be having contract manufacture done somewhere else. So consider what the alternate supply capacity is, and so that you can swing to an alternative production fairly quickly. Consider how you might contract out production. You might have limited constraints within your business and so decide that you will keep the core elements in-house and you will short-term contract out parts of production. If you can have those relationships built, and sometimes they are with competitors, but with friendly competitors who will help you out in the crisis. If you can have those relationships built before a crisis, it's always valuable, but building them very quickly in a crisis may be your only option. But also consider the services that you can contract in, the things that you can do in a crisis that you don't normally do because you've lost a bit of market, but you can bring in supply capability for someone else. And finally, the other part of the supply chain equation is about redefining your supply channels. Loss of market needs to be addressed very quickly, so consider new channels to customers. And we're seeing that in the global pandemic at the moment. We're seeing a lot of businesses move from retail, bricks and mortars retail, to online retail. We're seeing businesses use other channel partners, different paths. I mean, restaurants becoming using home delivery services. We're seeing a significant improvement in companies in their digital presence. We're seeing companies having to find alternate logistics paths. I mean, air freight, a lot of air freight was in the bellies of passenger planes, and all of a sudden there's no passenger planes, so there's no spare capacity. So work with your logistics providers to seek new means of shipping very quickly in a global crisis. Seeking opportunities, I think was the next slide, Lisa, slide 6. So seeking opportunities in a crisis, innovation is the ultimate competitive weapon in business. I mean, that is a given. And so the ability to move quickly and to innovate quickly, new opportunities, seeking new customers or developing new product lines, transitioning your business. I mean, you're seeing that in this current pandemic. A lot of traditional on-premise providers, bars and restaurants, are swapping to, delivered home meals or just delivering the meal solutions part of a meal. You're seeing McDonald's selling milk and bread through their driveway pickups. You're seeing car part manufacturers move from making car parts to ventilators and medical devices. They're quite transformative moves, but they're about seeking the opportunity. And there is no rule book on this. It is absolutely go look, go consult, move quickly. The agility and the innovative way in which you approach new opportunities is what will get you through a crisis. It absolutely requires agile thinking. The great thing about thinking is there's no cost to thinking in a business. It's just something you have to do. And essentially it follows the same process as if you were doing this in new market development in normal business as usual times. You need to identify the market needs, refine your offering, look at how you can change what you do to suit a new customer or a new opportunity or a new market. You need to identify ways to leverage your situation and the crisis to the new opportunities. And that's what you're seeing a lot at the moment. There are some really smart businesses out there today that are going to survive the pandemic doing something completely different to what they've traditionally done. And leverage your learnings. You know, it's the old saying, never waste a good crisis. Ensure you record what you do, record your process, but use the adrenaline rush of a crisis to reconsider how you might change your business going forward. You know, some of the changes you make during a crisis are good for your business and you'll never go back from. So now at this slide, which is planning for a future crisis. As I've said many times, if you have a disaster recovery plan, that's great. If you don't, you should think about putting one together. But what is a disaster recovery plan? Essentially, it's a set of tested policies and procedures that deal with an unplanned event or a crisis, but specifically to ensure business continuity. So that is the whole point of this, is to ensure business continuity, business health. Disaster planning will ease the burden of any crisis because it provides that well-considered path. You've taken the time to think over a protracted period. You've cogitated and thought about what I need to do, and I've prepared, and where possible, I've mitigated or prevented risks. Now, some you can, some you can't prevent. But the first part of a disaster recovery plan is doing that risk assessment. And it's essential that all potential risks, including, first of all, identifying what the risks are, what the crisis potentials are, and then looking at those risks exactly the same as you'd look at any other risk in managing a business risk. You look at the likelihood of the risk occurring, you look at the impact of the risk, and you look at the control measures to prevent, mitigate, or respond to each risk. It's really no different to any other risk management exercise. It's just that the focus and the context of the risk assessment is on a disaster or crisis risk. Then, when you've identified those risks, assess those risks, you need to build the recovery plans. And the issues, although not exhaustive, but the issues that you need to consider in that is prevention mitigation measures, what backups do I need to have in place, what structures or processes can be designed to reduce the potential impact of a crisis. You're seeing a lot of work at the moment in the medical crises that we have at the moment around infection control, personal protective equipment. Now, that's not business as usual, but having considered that early and getting that in place very early is important to the ongoing survival of a business. Your response plans need to be reviewed and updated and tested regularly. You need to develop response plans for all your potential crisis risks. That's, fire safety plans, emergency response plans, flood plans. All of those need to be considered. At the moment, if you're in a pandemic crisis, you're probably not going to worry too much about the flood plan, but make sure you don't forget about it when you come out, because that might be the next crisis that follows if you're in a flood zone or a bushfire zone. Ensure your business has a continuity of production plan, which identifies alternate options for production, short-term contract sourcing, and how you might deal with loss of production capability. Ensure that you have a cybersecurity plan, including multiple data backups or cloud backup, or protection against cyber attack. Make sure that you have a product recall plan, because a reputational damage is a crisis in itself. So if you have a quality failure and have to recall a product, how you manage that recall really will determine how long lasting the impact of that crisis is on your business, that reputational crisis. And have a meeting and communications plan. Be planned for your communications. And whilst that's not an exhaustive list, it sort of gives you enough to kind of think about. But finally, I think one of the key issues around planning for a future crisis is business disruption or business continuity insurance. And whilst insurance won't prevent the risk of a crisis, it lessens the economic impact of the business disruption. So ensure that you regularly review insurance risk cover and protection to meet the needs of the business. You need to consult with your insurance broker to ensure that you get really good professional advice on what is appropriate cover. But also review your contract obligations to ensure that whether it's your contract with suppliers, your contract further upstream in the supply chain, are there force majeure contracts that will protect you in a crisis or will prevent you from leveraging a response within the supply chain? So make sure that your contracts, and you're seeing that a lot at the moment, people are calling force majeure, that has both a positive and a negative impact on a business. If it's your supplier calling force majeure on you, it's a negative impact. If it's you calling force majeure on someone that you need to supply, it may be a short-term positive for your business. But just review your contracts to see what you can do within your contracts around managing a crisis. And think about that creatively. Think about how I might draft or word the text of a supply contract that fairly deals with a major disruption that is unplanned and no one can actually foresee. And finally, to quote Winston Churchill, in nothing great, small, large, or petty, never give in except to convictions of honour and good sense. And so what I mean by that is or I'm sure what Winston Churchill meant by that, was when you're faced with adversity, doesn't matter how big or small it is, you've just got to push through. The only time you give in is to convictions of honour or good sense. So if it really is, you might get to a point where you do have to call an end to the business because the crisis has created such an economic impact that it just isn't going to survive. And that is do that with honour. Do that by communicating well to your stakeholders. And in many countries, it's illegal to trade whilst insolvent. And that if you genuinely can't sustain the business going forward, then it is the best decision. And with that, thank you for your attendance, and I'll hand it over to Lisa to curate the questions.
Thank you very much for that, Tristan, and an inspirational quote to finish off on. So we've got time for probably just only a couple of questions. But one of the things that I've got to here is that has been raised is, you talk about managing through a crisis, and then how to navigate looking at new opportunities. That is challenging to begin with for a business, particularly if they're in international markets. Entering a new market takes time, it takes investment, and it can take years to foster new relationships. So in terms of looking at this from the response of having to open new markets or look at new channels, what is it that a business, or so what is it that a business can do to navigate and mitigate their way through that? And how should they develop a plan?
So I think it's a very broad question. So deal with the first part around opportunity. It is no different. Looking at new opportunities, whether it's, you know, steady as you go, business as usual, or in a crisis, the process is the same. What changes though is the context for opportunities. And obviously in a small localized disruption, the opportunities are limited because the competition is greater. But the opportunities there are to actually go back and seek, you know, you have good, assuming you have, and most businesses do, have good relationships with their suppliers and their customers, the opportunities sit with going to talking to your suppliers and customers and saying, well, you know, what else can I do and what can I do differently? In a pandemic, like we're seeing at the moment, a global crisis, the whole context to the market changes. And so new opportunities arise and are created very, very quickly. And we're seeing that at the moment in the current global crises. And because those opportunities are created very quickly, often there is an opportunity to seize a market much more easily than it would be in a time of business as usual, steady as she goes kind of operations. And you're seeing that in some of the distillers who made alcoholic beverages, realizing that, you know, with all the bars shut, they're not going to sell much alcohol, and then kind of go, well, where's the opportunity? Oh, the opportunity is actually in hand sanitizer, because that's also alcohol. And so transitioning very quickly their business, I mean, it's at the end of the day, the formulation changed a little bit. It was still alcohol, still going into a bottle, slightly different bottle, slightly different label, but it was capturing a market that had no alternative at the time. We were short of sanitizer. So I think the point around seeking opportunity is in a crisis, there are different opportunities and they come about very quickly. Equally, in a regional crisis, you know, if you're seeing a flood or an earthquake or bushfires, as we saw in Australia earlier on this year, you may find an opportunity that exists because of that crisis. And you need to consider those and consider how you attack each and every one of those markets. And sometimes it might be, and you're certainly seeing that at the moment, that you've got an international market and all of a sudden you have to change that to a domestic market. Equally, the opportunities can arise in some of the smaller exporting nations where they've struggled to get into bricks and mortar operations for retail. And all of a sudden, there's a whole global market that is flipped to online purchases. People who have never been who've never or rarely bought online are now buying regularly online. So that in itself is an opportunity to go from your traditional market channels or your traditional distribution partners to a new opportunity, a different opportunity. I mean, the opportunity for online's always been there. It's just the scale of the market's changed. So I think that's what I mean by seeking out those opportunities and looking for where an opportunity may exist because of a crisis or because of a market response to you being in a crisis.
Thank you. So probably only have time for one more question, but what should businesses do if their supply chain is impacted? Because you know, a large amount of businesses rely on various inputs into their product to then to assemble it and resell it. But, you know, the whole, as you have alluded to, the whole world has been affected by this crisis. And so supply chain disruption is a massive issue. And so what does that mean then for me as a small business that relies on certain supplier inputs, or then selling into to other suppliers?
So there are three aspects to that. And there is no right answer. But the three aspects are suppliers, logistic paths, and channels to customers. And I'll deal with those separately. In terms of suppliers and supply chain disruption, absolutely, you may see that in a crisis, suppliers to you are impacted and can't supply, or have limited capacity to supply, or don't supply the new goods that you need to transition to a different market. So again, it's in a global sort of crisis where everybody is much more flexible because they have to be. It is about seeking, very first point is talk to your suppliers. Try and work out together how you might overcome that supply deficiency. Secondly, look for alternate suppliers. And generally in a pandemic kind of or global crisis situation, everybody's looking for business. So everyone will talk to you, even people who may have considered you too small or too big or too whatever, or too far away previously, they will be open to engaging. So yeah, talk to your suppliers first, try and work together to build a solution, look for alternate suppliers, and look for alternate supplies in terms of maybe you change the materials that you use, maybe you look for something different into the production process. The next thing is disruptions around logistics paths. And as I mentioned, you know, the loss of air freight in bellies of passenger planes is critical at the moment. But the businesses that will survive are the businesses that work with their logistics providers to find the alternate solutions. And now we have seen that. We've seen a lot of dedicated freight. I mean, the dedicated freight aircraft are doing very well at the moment because that is the logistics have swung to that. But with limited space availability, it is about ensuring that you're in there, and the best way to do that is to work with your logistics provider and to do it early, to get in early with your logistics provider to work on the alternate solutions to logistics. Finally, there's the disruption in channel partners. You know, bricks and mortar shops got shut down in a pandemic. How do I get my product out? And again, it's seeking the alternate channels, whether that be online or whether that be through, I mean, as we're seeing at the moment with the global health crisis, your bricks and mortar stores are shutting down, people are moving online, but people are also moving to different, more direct delivery models. And so it's not necessary that you have to be the online store. If you look at the restaurant industry, the menu log, Uber Eats, all of those kind of home delivery services have become their new channel partners. So I think that's, there is no single solution. The answer really is collaboration and looking at the breadth of opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I think we're going to have to call it a halt there because we're coming up close to the hour. But I would really like to thank you very much for your presentation today, which was very thorough. And I think one of the outcomes of this is that crises aren't going away. We're even before the health pandemic, we were dealing with issues around geopolitical impacts on trade that are affecting the way we do business. We also have greater threats on, for example, cybersecurity, which is a crisis in itself that can affect you. We have the impacts of climate change now having huge impacts in certain parts of the world. And not only that, but we are also dealing with an unprecedented rise in how technology is transforming the way we do business, the way it will affect our labor force going forward. So in essence, if I was to sum it up, whilst this is a huge health crisis that has immediately impacted the economy, most businesses are going to have to be prepared to have rolling plans that are going to deal with fast-paced change now, because change is never ending. And so having plans that can respond to that are really, obviously, as you say, are really quite important. I don't know if you have any further thing to comment on that, but in essence, we're sort of dealing with quite a lot, and the more businesses can take the learning lessons around this and apply it for future and have that strategy and plan in place, the better.
Absolutely. And the one guarantee, the one thing for sure, is this won't be the last crisis, and you'll never know what the next one is or when it's going to come.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you so much, Tristan, for that presentation. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are about to release our next series of business health checks. We're taking a slightly different approach for the rest of the year, and we're starting off with a whole series on e-commerce. So how you as a business can, as Tristan alluded to as well, look at the e-commerce opportunity and the online opportunity. And we're breaking that down into a series of 5 different sessions. And then we're going to move towards a more market-driven sort of series, where we're going to look at different ways in which you can look at new market opportunities in different countries. So on that note, I'll just say thank you finally again to Tristan, thank you to everyone, and we look forward to our next session. Thank you.
Thank you.